In this video, we will explore how warfare, finance, and political power became inseparable during one of Europe's most transformative periods, examining how Napoleon's conquests were sustained, priced, and ultimately constrained by the financial mechanisms behind them. Napoleon did more than defeat rival armies and topple dynasties. He converted the European continent into a source of income. Kingdoms moved under his influence, massive armies crossed frontiers with methodical coordination. Thrones collapsed, accords were imposed, and borders were redrawn. Yet away from the noise of battle, another process unfolded, colder, more deliberate. Napoleon assembled a military system that compelled Europe to underwrite its own domination. This is the domain of financial history, where capital, authority, and conflict intersect, and where appearances consistently mislead. At the apex of his dominance, Napoleon exercised direct control or overwhelming influence across lands stretching from the Iberian Peninsula to Poland, from the shores of the North Sea to southern Italy. At its peak, the Grande Armée mobilized forces exceeding 600,000 men. Nothing of this magnitude had been attempted before. Feeding, equipping, transporting, and compensating such numbers demanded extraordinary resources. Yet the contradiction is central to the story. When Napoleon seized power in 1799, France was not a wealthy state. It was economically shattered. To understand how this empire functioned, the story must begin with breakdown. By the late 1780s, the French monarchy was overwhelmed by liabilities. The 7 Years' War drained the treasury. Financial backing for the American Revolution added roughly 1.3 billion livres to royal debt. By 1788, servicing that debt consumed more than half of the crown's income. The collapse of the monarchy was not driven by political philosophy alone. It fell because it could no longer meet its financial obligations. What followed was revolution, and a monetary experiment that pushed the country toward ruin. In 1790, revolutionary authorities introduced assignats, paper notes backed by confiscated church property. Initially, the idea appeared practical: convert seized land into liquidity, stabilize commerce, and restore confidence. Instead, issuance accelerated without restraint. By 1795, more than 45 billion livres in assignats circulated. Inflation surged, the currency disintegrated, prices exploded. Personal savings vanished, confidence collapsed. France endured something approaching hyperinflation. Improvisation briefly substituted for stability, and then the system imploded. This was the France Napoleon inherited after the coup of 18 Brumaire in 1799, a society exhausted by terror, economic chaos, and continuous war against multiple coalitions. Napoleon grasped a fundamental principle: sustained warfare cannot coexist with monetary disorder. His initial priority was not expansion abroad, but consolidation at home. In 1800, he created the Bank of France. While not independent by modern standards, it reintroduced financial structure. In 1803, he implemented the franc germinal, a metallic currency tied to gold and silver, designed to be reliable and stable. Taxation was centralized. Administration was reorganized. Corruption was curtailed. Public accounts were brought under tighter supervision. Within France, Napoleon managed fiscal policy with notable discipline. In the early years, state budgets were frequently balanced. Tax revenues became dependable. Internal finances stabilized. The turning point came with a strategic decision. Napoleon refused to place the full financial burden of permanent war on the French population. Instead, he displaced those costs outward. After every major victory, defeated states were compelled to pay indemnities. These payments were not symbolic penalties. They were large-scale transfers of wealth. In 1805, following Austria's defeat at Austerlitz, the Treaty of Pressburg imposed indemnities totaling 40 million francs, a severe blow relative to Austrian revenues. In 1807, Prussia's defeat led to the Treaty of Tilsit, which demanded contributions estimated around 120 million francs. To put this in context, France's annual military spending in the early 1800s hovered between 600 and 700 million francs. A single imposed payment could fund months of campaigning. Napoleon's approach was ruthlessly systematic. Territory was conquered, indemnities were levied, French troops were quartered at the expense of occupied states, and resources, cash, grain, horses, supplies, were extracted. Those resources then financed subsequent campaigns. War financed war. At various points, external contributions covered a significant share of France's military costs. German states within the Confederation of the Rhine supplied money and soldiers. Italian territories financed garrisons. The Netherlands carried heavy fiscal burdens. Spain, before rebellion erupted, was integrated into the structure. This was not uncontrolled plunder. It was organized extraction. Napoleon transformed military victory into predictable revenue, but the model carried an unavoidable mathematical limitation. It depended on continuous expansion. As long as France achieved decisive victories, new income streams emerged. Each success funded the next mobilization. The empire functioned like a leveraged growth strategy. Expansion masked liabilities. Once expansion slowed, obligations remained. Beyond indemnities, Napoleon also imposed forced loans, compelling cities and states to extend credit to the French administration. These were mandatory contributions, enforced through occupation. Conscription supplied manpower, but financing sustained everything else. Supplying hundreds of thousands of troops required logistical systems unseen in Europe until then. The Grande Armée consumed vast quantities of food, livestock, uniforms, weapons, and artillery. This was not feudal raiding, it was large-scale mobilization on the edge of industrial capacity. Napoleon's most ambitious economic weapon followed in 1806, the continental system. Unable to defeat Britain at sea, he attempted to break it economically. The Berlin Decree prohibited European states under French control from trading with Britain. The objective was to choke British exports, weaken its economy, and force surrender. On paper, the strategy appeared aggressive and logical. Britain relied heavily on trade. In reality, it was a gamble that destabilized the continent itself. European economies were deeply connected to British commerce. Manufactured goods, textiles, and colonial imports flowed through British networks. Cutting those links disrupted internal economic circulation across Europe. Smuggling surged. Coastal regions evaded enforcement, black markets expanded, merchants suffered losses, industries contracted. Russia, increasingly strained by the system, began violating it. That defiance triggered one of the most disastrous decisions in European financial history. In 1812, Napoleon launched the invasion of Russia. Roughly 600,000 troops drawn from across the empire, and its satellites were mobilized. It was the largest army Europe had ever assembled, and an immense financial drain. Supply lines stretched across thousands of kilometers. Provisioning such forces demanded extraordinary resources. As the campaign faltered and winter arrived, losses escalated catastrophically. Fewer than 100,000 soldiers returned in fighting condition. The human cost was immense. The financial impact was decisive. Napoleon's system relied on victorious campaigns that generated revenue. The Russian campaign produced only expense. No indemnities followed, no tribute flowed. Instead, manpower, supplies, and morale were exhausted. After 1812, France could no longer convert military momentum into cash flow. The Grande Armée was broken. Satellite states hesitated. Resistance intensified. Britain, supported by deep capital markets and public borrowing, financed continental allies. By 1813, coalition forces advanced into Central Europe. Engagements such as Leipzig involved hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Financing mobilization at that scale strained every treasury involved. And here the shift became unmistakable. As French armies retreated, indemnities ceased. France now faced war expenditures without external funding. The burden returned inward. Napoleon's domestic fiscal discipline functioned only because foreign resources absorbed much of the cost. Once that stream vanished, France confronted the same structural reality that had destabilized the monarchy decades earlier. Were demanded resources that domestic revenue alone could not sustain. Britain operated on a fundamentally different model. Instead of relying on extraction, it depended on public debt markets. Long-term bonds financed conflict across decades. Investors purchased government debt because repayment was credible. Parliamentary authority and the Bank of England provided institutional continuity. By 1815, British public debt exceeded 200% of GDP. Yet it remained manageable because the system was institutionalized rather than dependent on expansion. Napoleon's framework was dynamic but brittle. Britain's was slower but scalable. This contrast reshaped Europe after 1815. Following Napoleon's abdication in 1814, his brief return, and final defeat at Waterloo in 1815, the continent entered reconstruction. The Congress of Vienna redrew borders, but financial damage could not be erased diplomatically. Years of war had disrupted economies and accumulated obligations. The direction of indemnities reversed. Defeated France was required to pay 700 million francs in reparations. Allied occupation forces remained until payments were secured. The empire that once extracted wealth now surrendered it. The structure inverted. France stabilized more quickly than expected under the restored monarchy, but the lesson endured. Military dominance, unsupported by sustainable finance, was fragile. The implications extended beyond France. The Napoleonic Wars accelerated a transformation in European finance. Britain's capacity to sustain prolonged conflict through credit demonstrated that institutional trust could outlast battlefield volatility. Sovereign debt evolved into a strategic instrument. Capital markets emerged from the conflict entrenched, not weakened. Investors financing British bonds were effectively underwriting geopolitical outcomes. Finance and power fused. London's role as a global financial center strengthened under wartime pressure. On the continent, reform followed defeat. Prussia restructured taxation and administration. Austria modernized aspects of fiscal management. The shock forced adaptation. Poorly financed war collapses states. Structurally financed war reshapes them. Napoleon did not merely fight wars. He tested a theory. Externalize the costs of dominance. Shift burdens outward. Let conquered territories fund expansion. The approach succeeded until conditions changed. This pattern is not confined to the past. Modern powers still attempt to shift costs externally. Sanctions redirect pressure. Trade policies move burdens through supply chains. Currency dominance allows inflation or deficits to be displaced globally. The ability to externalize cost is power, but only temporarily. Napoleon's empire resembled a leveraged growth strategy. Expansion sustained obligations. Victory justified extraction. Growth maintained liquidity. When growth reversed, leverage collapsed the system. Modern financial systems operate on similar logic, though with greater complexity. Governments issue debt, expecting future growth to service it. Central banks supply liquidity to prevent contraction. Capital flows stabilize imbalances until they fail. Continuous leverage demands continuous growth. This is not cynicism, it is arithmetic. Scale alone does not guarantee durability. An army of 600,000 could not preserve the empire once financing failed. Military capacity without scalable funding becomes untenable. Napoleon was not recklessly incompetent financially. He stabilized currency, reformed administration, improved tax collection, and corrected revolutionary excesses. But his strategic model assumed that political dominance would indefinitely generate economic extraction. It was a growth strategy without an endpoint. Once Europe coordinated financially and militarily, the structure collapsed. Coalition powers defeated France not only with armies, but with credit. British subsidies financed resistance. Debt functioned as ammunition. Money and power were inseparable. In the modern system, the United States occupies a position somewhat analogous to Britain after 1815. It anchors the dominant reserve currency. Deep capital markets sustain high public debt. Treasury securities function as global collateral. That position offers flexibility, deficit financing, crisis response, liquidity provision. But it rests on credibility. Britain preserved trust through institutional restraint and reliable debt service. Without trust, rates would have surged and the system would have fractured. The rule is universal. Externalizing costs works while credibility holds. When credibility fails, burdens return home. Napoleon learned this when expansion ceased and indemnities vanished. Contemporary economies rely not on tribute, but on growth assumptions, global demand for debt, and confidence in institutional continuity. Every dominant power eventually believes its model is exceptional. Spain believed silver was endless. Napoleon believed victory would perpetuate revenue. Systems at their peak appear invulnerable until constraints emerge. The Napoleonic Wars did not bankrupt Europe overnight. They redistributed pressure. They restructured financial hierarchies. They proved that institutional credit outlasts conquest-based financing. Europe's most formidable army fell. Its strongest bond market endured. This is the economic conflict beneath the battlefield narrative. For those concerned with financial literacy and real wealth, the lesson matters. Bubbles, debt crises, and inflation cycles revolve around sustainability versus expansion, leverage versus discipline, extraction versus productivity. At the individual level, the principle is identical. Strategies dependent on constant inflow, rising asset prices, speculation, leverage, appear unstoppable until inflow slows. Systems built on consistent cash flow and resilience endure cycles. Napoleon's empire was brilliant, rapid, and innovative, but it required motion. When momentum stopped, costs surfaced. History does not punish ambition, it punishes unsustainable finance. The Napoleonic era was not only about cannons and cavalry, it was about ledgers and bonds. It was about who paid, who extracted, and who endured. The enduring empire was not the one that conquered the most land, it was the one that mastered credit. If this offered a new perspective, consider subscribing. History answers questions markets still ask today.